Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're in session number 3 of our new series on the update on the QME regulations. And in this series, we're talking about the select changes to the new proposed QME regulations that are anticipated to impact the day-to-day operations of you as a qualified medical evaluator. And I've selected from the new proposed changes, those changes that are most likely to have some bearing on the way that you practice as a qualified medical evaluator. Now, these new proposed changes are just that. They're in the proposal state. In fact, these new proposed changes are now in the public comment period. And the purpose of the public comment period is to help review and tweak the language of these proposed changes in the regulations. Because when these new proposed changes to the QME regulations were written, of course, at that time, it's impossible to be able to foresee every possible application or implication of the changed regulations, and that therefore the Division of Workers' Compensation enlists the help of many, many minds to review the new proposed changes and comment on those proposed changes. And I myself have made some comments on these changes wherein the language of the proposed language has some inconsistencies or incongruities with various other regulations that we're now operating under. And so the new proposed changes are expected to be slightly modified as the language gets tweaked and fine-tuned. But in spirit, I fully anticipate each of these new proposed changes to the QME regulations to be passed, to be implemented, and to be enacted into law. And the reason that I expect that is because all of the new proposed changes to the QME regulations are good changes. They're all changes for the better. And if you'll take the time to review these new proposed changes, after you read several of the regulations, you'll realize that these are all good. The purpose of these regulations is to make the system better. And I'm sharing with you some of those improvements that we can look forward to as we extend our career as qualified medical evaluators. So in session number 1, we talked about the overview of the selected and newly proposed changes. In our last session, we spent some time about CCR 31.3 and what it has to say about scheduling QME appointments with you in your office as a qualified medical evaluator. And I shared with you some terrific ideas that you can immediately implement to help increase the profitability of each and every appointment call that you receive in your office. So if you didn't have a chance to tune in on that discussion, I strongly encourage you to go back and listen to that several times, because there's 2 classifications of appointment phone calls that we receive, and those are the profitable QME evaluations, and on the other end of the spectrum are requests for QME evaluations that are unprofitable or poorly profitable. And it's up to you to determine the difference, and it's up to you to wrestle with the parties to construe each request for QME appointment that you receive into a profitable evaluation for yourself and for your practice. We spent some time, and we're going to spend more time today talking about the Division of Workers' Compensation's new position on bias in the qualified medical evaluation. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time, even over the next 2 sessions, talking about what the Division of Workers' Compensation is planning in an effort to stamp out discrimination, bias, and stereotyping in the work that we as qualified medical evaluators do. And I have some things to share with you that are certainly going to blow your mind about how bias and discrimination exists in the medical legal evaluation. We spent some time talking about new regulations related to our evaluation and reporting guidelines. And we're going to spend more time on this in 2 sessions from now. And I'm going to share with you how you can streamline your evaluation approach to get to the heart of the matter quickly. And the heart of the matter involves you being able to resolve disputed issues so that the parties can move the case forward. And the heart of the matter involves you being able to do that very, very, very quickly. And the new proposed changes to the regulations assist us in doing just that. So I consider the new proposed changes to be good changes. And we'll talk more about this in approximately 2 sessions from now. We spent just a little bit of time talking about how the new changes to the proposed regulations are going to allow us to service the parties with our reports and all the associated documents electronically. Now, we can currently already do this due to the COVID regulations, the temporary COVID emergency regulations, but the new proposed changes under CCR 36.7 are projected to extend our ability to continue to service the parties electronically into the future and forever. And in my opinion, this is a good thing. It's a good thing because it substantially reduces the bulky, burdensome, cumbersome process of printing out and mailing hard copy documents to all the parties, and certainly eliminates the cost of affixing postage and using hard supplies. And then it eliminates the cost and the time and the energy involved with taking all of that stuff down to the post office. So this in itself greatly is expected to streamline the process that we do in terms of how we service the parties with our finished product, which is our QME report. We're going to talk, and we did talk a little bit about some of the unfortunate circumstances that qualified medical evaluators can find themselves in that results in the Division of Workers' Compensation taking a hardline stance to deny the qualified medical evaluator's reappointment for another 2-year appointment cycle. And in this area, the Division of Workers' Compensation is tightening down the screws a little bit to allow only safe and quality evaluators to continue to serve in the capacity as qualified medical evaluators. So I shared with you a couple of common pitfalls that you should consciously attempt to avoid in your face-to-face evaluation and then also in the production of your QME report. And we'll spend quite a bit more time on this in an upcoming session. Now, in today's session, I want to begin a 2-part series about bias in California's workers' compensation system. And because the workers' compensation system is simply a subcategory of life in general, it's simply a selected slice of a much larger pie of life here in California. And because bias is present everywhere in life, it should come as no surprise that there is rampant and abundant bias in the California workers' compensation in every arm and every aspect of workers' compensation. Well, the Division of Workers' Compensation is attempting to stamp out as many forms of bias and as many sources of bias as they can, and they're taking many active measures to accomplish just that objective. And I want to share with you how this relates to us as qualified medical evaluators and how we as qualified medical evaluators can render opinions and conclusions that are more accurate by eliminating some of our implicit and unconscious biases in our opinions and conclusions. And when I first heard this idea, it was a mind blower to me, and I'm sure it's going to be a mind blower to you, that you may have biases that help shape your opinions and conclusions. And because those opinions and conclusions are based on some type of an unconscious or implicit bias, your opinions and conclusions may not always be accurate. And the Division of Workers' Compensation is concerned with accuracy of impairment ratings, accuracy of disability awards, for all persons, regardless of age, race, sex, national origin, sexual preference, or any other target of bias and/or discrimination. So this is going to be a fascinating discussion for you, and this is going to help you get a jump start on the new mindset of qualified medical evaluations when these new proposed changes to the QME regulations actually do get passed here in the very near future. Okay, so with that as our introduction, let's begin today's session, which is number 3 on the update of the QME regulations. And today we're specifically talking about anti-bias training for qualified medical evaluators. Okay, so let's begin today's discussion, which is on anti-bias training for the qualified medical evaluator. Now, if you think about the life cycle or the lifespan of a qualified medical evaluator, it's a fairly typical lifespan that we all go through. So in the beginning, you or I and all of us were at one point in time basically unaware of the workers' compensation system and unaware of the QME system. And we were soldiering along in our clinical practice when all of a sudden we learned about the opportunity of a qualified medical evaluator credential. And so we signed up to take the QME examination. And at that point in time, the moment in time in which we signed up to become a qualified medical evaluator, that began our life cycle as a QME. Well, that life cycle can continue for many of us for years and years and even decades, multiple decades, until such point in time as we eventually decide to declare ourselves no longer available for qualified medical evaluations. And this time period, which can be decades, represents the life cycle of a QME. Well, it should come as no surprise that the Division of Workers' Compensation is targeting each stage throughout the life cycle of a qualified medical evaluator and is taking active measures at many of the stages in order to stamp out bias throughout the lifespan of a qualified medical evaluator. So, for example, with the initial appointment of you and of new doctors as qualified medical evaluators, the Division of Workers' Compensation has a new proposed change to the QME regulations. In this case, it's CCR 11, Section H, which describes the eligibility requirements for appointment as a qualified medical evaluator. These eligibility requirements are going to contain anti-bias training, such that new qualified medical evaluators who are launching their long career as qualified medical evaluator will begin their career with the proper mindset to produce opinions and conclusions that are free of bias, free of stereotyping, and free of discrimination, so that their opinions and conclusions can be at all times accurate. Okay? Well, what about when the qualified medical evaluator then becomes credentialed and then begins actually seeing injured workers in the face-to-face evaluation? Well, the Division of Workers' Compensation has long thought about the face-to-face interaction of qualified medical evaluators with examinees, and they've long had in place anti-bias measures in the form of CCR 40, the disclosure requirements. And we'll talk about the disclosure requirements, and these are not new, but they're going to persist and be accompanied by these new changes such that there's a synergy that starts to develop, and a common theme and a common language that begins to perpetuate itself throughout the life cycle of a qualified medical evaluator. Well, the philosophy continues and extends to the qualified medical evaluator's report and the opinions and conclusions that the qualified medical evaluator offers in the final product of his QME report. And this involves new CCR 35.5H, which involves a mandatory declaration that's going to be installed, or that will be required to be installed, in our disclosures at the end of our reports. So this mandatory declaration, which we'll review the language of it in its entirety, alerts the parties and informs the parties that within the body of the QME report, the opinions and conclusions provided by the qualified medical evaluator are free from bias, are free from discrimination, are free from any stereotyping related to age, related to sex, related to gender, related to religious denomination, or any other target of bias that could impact the qualified medical evaluator's opinions and conclusions. And then finally, and ongoing throughout the career and life cycle of a qualified medical evaluator, the Division of Workers' Compensation has ongoing measures to continue to train qualified medical evaluators on issues related to discrimination and bias. So all of our continuing education programs moving forward, according to new changes of CCR 55, are going to include training in anti-bias evaluations. It's going to continue to require every 2 years that we complete anti-bias training and that we document successful completion of training to eliminate bias in the work that we do. And for those evaluators who stubbornly fail to adopt this training into their evaluations, new language in CCR 51.10 is going to provide a basis for the Division of Workers' Compensation to deny reappointment for a new 2-year term for those qualified medical evaluators who continue to show a stubborn disregard for the spirit of the new regulations, which involves fairness and accuracy for all persons. So in this way, the Division of Workers' Compensation is going to be monitoring the life cycle of qualified medical evaluators from inception, even before appointment, all the way to the conclusion of their career, to eliminate bias in the work that we do. And this is just one small measure that the Division of Workers' Compensation is taking as it targets the entire workers' compensation system. Here, it's targeting the medical legal evaluation, but it's part of their overall objective to provide more fairness in the system. Okay, so now let's talk about what the Division of Workers' Compensation has in store for us along each one of these steps along the life cycle of a qualified medical evaluator. Okay, so let's get busy with these new proposed changes into the QME regulations. And in today's session, we'll review the new language of the regulations. And in our next session, I'm going to show you several examples as to how bias can manifest itself in inaccurate opinions and conclusions in the QME's reporting, and how that inaccuracy adversely affects the injured worker or / examinee. So to begin with regards to the QME's initial appointment, CCR 11 Section H tells us that now, moving forward, prior to appointment as a QME, all new QME applicants shall complete a course of at least 2 hours in anti-bias training. The course shall include the following, and this is critical, and this sets the tone for the entire lifespan of a qualified medical evaluator. It shall include instruction designed to increase awareness and understanding of differences in human experience, as well as awareness of implicit or unconscious bias. And we're going to define this in just a minute. Implicit or unconscious means below the level of consciousness. Unconscious bias, stereotyping, and discrimination, and the ways in which unconscious bias can unintentionally impact perceptions and decision making, including in medical evaluations and reporting, such as what we do as qualified medical evaluators, and therefore can lead to disparities in healthcare strategies based upon those unconscious biases, which adversely impact the particular target, the particular examinee, that is the victim of this faulty medical decision making. The purpose of which is to help eliminate or reduce implicit bias in medical evaluations and reporting, and this is specifically dealing with the qualified medical evaluation. Okay? So let's define this unconscious bias, and this is a definition that comes straight out of Wikipedia. Wikipedia tells us that unconscious or implicit bias, and by the way, these are synonymous terms, sometimes used interchangeably. Sometimes you'll see it written unconscious bias, sometimes you'll see it written as implicit bias. Here in the language of CCR 11H, the Division of Workers' Compensation uses both terms. They use the term unconscious bias, and then here they use the term implicit bias. Okay, so they both refer to underlying attitudes and stereotypes that people unconsciously attribute to another person or group of people. Now, let's just stop right here. Let's just stop right here. And if you imagine the face-to-face evaluation with only two people, with only the qualified medical evaluator and the examinee, those two people represent two distinct groups. The group with the qualified medical evaluator is the evaluators, and the injured worker is the examinee group. So these are distinct and disparate groups. So all of a sudden we have two groups, each of which may have some attitudes and stereotypes regarding the other group. So you as the qualified medical evaluator might define your examinees as, injured workers. They're injured workers, or they're examinees, and the examinees refer to us as, doctors. They're the doctor. And each of these parties have attitudes and stereotypes, unconscious, that they attribute to each of us. Well, unfortunately, these underlying stereotypes can affect how each party understands and engages with a person or group. And we all have these unconscious biases that we learn early on in life, that we adopt early on in life, that affect how we interact with persons of the so-called out group, the group outside of our own experience. Well, the Division of Workers' Compensation is looking for us, is asking us as qualified medical evaluators to, as much as possible, to take a look at our attitudes and at our stereotypes. And we'll talk more about these as we go. And to eliminate any of these stereotypes from our medical decision-making process. Okay, and let's continue with this definition again from Wikipedia. Wikipedia tells us that implicit bias or implicit stereotype is the pre-reflective, meaning before you have the opportunity to even reflect on your opinion. It's the pre-reflective attribution of particular qualities by an individual, and in this case, this is by qualified medical evaluators, to a member of some social outgroup. And in this case, the social outgroup is the examinees upon who we render our opinions and conclusions. Well, those opinions and conclusions can, in many cases, be based upon these pre-reflective attribution of particular qualities on an unsuspecting or undeserving examinee. And I'll give several examples of that in our next session. Implicit stereotypes are thought to be shaped by experience and based on learned associations between particular qualities and social categories. So, for example, if I was to say the word to you, jock, J-O-C-K, the social category of what we consider to be jocks, what kind of qualities, type of particular qualities do you attribute to the word jock? We all have a certain mental image picture of what is meant by the word jock and what type of person represents that particular social category. And the Division of Workers' Compensation is asking us as qualified medical evaluators to eliminate those stereotypes that we all have. So social categories can include race and or gender, and the Division of Workers' Compensation is expanding the list of different social categories, including age as a social category, race, gender, sexual preference, and religious beliefs. Those are all being included in the Division of Workers' Compensation's new endeavor to stamp out bias. So finally, individuals' perceptions and behaviors can be influenced by the implicit stereotypes that they hold, even if they are sometimes unaware that they hold such stereotypes. And we all have these. There's nothing wrong about it, except to the extent that it creates opinions and conclusions in our QME reports that are not accurate. Implicit bias is an aspect of implicit social cognition, the phenomenon that perceptions, attitudes, and stereotypes can operate even prior to conscious intention or endorsement. And the Division of Workers' Compensation has a growing stack of examples where qualified medical evaluators' perceptions, their attitudes, and their stereotypes have operated to the detriment and to the unfair and inaccurate opinions and conclusions that serve to discriminate against certain social categories and certain different types of examinees that we encounter. Okay, so now continuing with CCR 11H, and even prior to your appointment as a qualified medical evaluator, your anti-bias training must, in addition to what we just talked about, eliminating implicit bias, eliminating unconscious bias and stereotyping, your training must involve at least one example of a potential gender bias in a fictitious QME evaluation in which an apportionment rating, this is amazing and fascinating, in which an apportionment rating is made based on an assumption about a risk factor related solely to the injured worker's gender. And I can tell you that even as we speak right now, there is legislation that's being proposed to change the language of of Labor Code 4663, which is one of our apportionment labor codes, along with 4664. There's new proposed changes to 4663 to include this language in the language of the law of 4663, such that the qualified medical evaluator acknowledges that their apportionment approximate percentages are not based in any way upon stereotypes related to age, sex, gender, and all those things that we talked about previously. This is being proposed to be written into the apportionment law, okay? And this is not new. This has been proposed in the past, but it's never yet been acted upon by our governor or governors at the time. But I can tell you that now that this movement is gaining momentum, and I expect that very shortly the language of 4663 will accommodate this new requirement that apportionment approximate percentages be accurate for all persons and not be based upon assumptions about any stereotypes, specifically stereotypes related to gender. Finally, it must include at least one example relating to an evaluation and rating of permanent disability resulting from industrial breast cancer, say for example in a police officer or a firefighter for whom instances of breast cancer are presumed to be industrial, taking into account the ways in which gender bias could potentially impact an assessment of the impairment that results from breast cancer and its treatment. And I'll just share with you a little bit of the background related to this change in the language of CCR 11. And this has to do with the fact that the AMA guides, the chapters in the AMA guides, are largely written by men. Okay, most of the chapters in the AMA guides are written by men. Well, with regards to breast cancer and the treatment involved with breast cancer, and even the removal of a breast through mastectomy, and even the replacement of a cosmetic breast through a breast implant, none of those scenarios carry with them any permanent impairment rating, especially for a woman who is not of breastfeeding age. So for postmenopausal women who are no longer childbearing and certainly not involved in breastfeeding, the removal of a breast carries with it a 0% whole person impairment rating. And yet there are many, many women who have gone through breast cancer treatment who are left with significant and multivaried types of impairment that, at least under the strict application of the AMA guides, provides for a 0% whole person impairment rating. And the position of the Division of Workers' Compensation is that this represents gender bias, because actually women will tell you, who have been through this breast cancer treatment and breast cancer surgery, that they are left with definite and definable losses for activities of daily living and even losses of body parts, for which the AMA guides should provide some type of a permanent impairment rating. And it's this instruction that's now being required in order to qualify to sit for the QME examination, that the qualified medical evaluator peruse the four corners of the AMA guides and be able to ascertain the various chapters from which a woman may qualify for permanent impairment ratings for industrial breast cancer. So this confirms the Division of Workers' Compensation's intent to target gender bias. Now, in the face-to-face evaluation, knee-to-knee with an injured worker, the Division of Workers' Compensation is combating bias through the unchanged language of CCR 40, the disclosure requirements. Now, this is language that has long been in effect because the Division of Workers' Compensation has been long aware that qualified medical evaluators can have various attitudes and stereotypes regarding various groups of examinees, typical of the injured worker examinee population. And so the language of CCR 40 is unchanged, and I'm encouraging you as a qualified medical evaluator to go through the disclosure requirements with each and every examinee. Now, many qualified medical evaluators do not do this, even though it's required by law. It's CCR 40 that requires that we sit knee-to-knee with our examinee and inform our examinee, in other words, that we disclose to the examinee. These are the things that we're required to disclose to our examinee before beginning the face-to-face evaluation. And we're required to disclose to our examinee that you as the examinee, you as an injured worker, Mrs. Jones, you may discontinue this evaluation if you're not comfortable here. If you're not comfortable, you don't have to put up with any kind of attitude or stereotyping or any kind of condescension or discrimination from the doctor. Okay, you don't have to put up with that, and we're required to tell the examinee of this before we begin. Now, Mrs. Jones, if you're not comfortable here, you can leave. And you can leave if you feel that the doctor is discriminatory toward you in any way. Certainly if you feel the doctor is discriminatory based upon your race, based upon your sex or gender, based upon your national origin, based upon your religious background or religious affiliation, or based upon your sexual preference. Mrs. Jones, if you're not comfortable here and if you feel the doctor has an attitude regarding any of these things, the doctor makes offhand remarks or snide comments about any of these things, guess what? The injured worker can discontinue the evaluation. And if the injured worker discontinues the evaluation, you as the qualified medical evaluator are going to be in some trouble. So the disclosure requirements is a great way for you, it's a great procedure for you to get your mind frame set properly prior to each and every evaluation. And I strongly encourage that you adopt this procedure of going through the disclosure requirements with each and every examinee. And further, Mrs. Jones, if you feel that the doctor is abusive, is hostile, or is rude, or in any way indicates some sort of bias against injured workers, you don't have to put up with that, and you can leave. And this language remains unchanged, and this is how the Division of Workers' Compensation, through requiring this by law, this is how the Division of Workers' Compensation combats bias in the face-to-face evaluation. And in my opinion, this is a good procedure, and this is a good thing. Okay, so you've made it through your QME appointment, your initial appointment as a QME, and you've been appointed as a QME, and you've had your first face-to-face evaluation with the injured worker, and all parties are so far satisfied that you're not harboring implicit or unconscious biases or stereotypes that are affecting your opinions and conclusions. Are you home free now, or are there other safeguards that the Division of Workers' Compensation is planning for you? Well, there are. And CCR 35.5 is new. And this is a new section of the QME regulations. This is new law, which, if passed, will require each reporting evaluator to include in the report a declaration under penalty of perjury. I, John Smith, QME, declare under penalty of perjury that I did not discriminate in any way against the parties to the action. That's the claims administrator, that's the applicant attorney, that's the defense attorney, or I did not discriminate in any way against the injured worker in the evaluation process or in the content of the report. And let me tell you, this opens up a large can of worms for one or the other of the parties to object to you as the qualified medical evaluator on the basis of some form of discrimination. I mean, if you think about it, this includes as many as 4 parties: the injured worker, claims administrator, applicant attorney, and defense attorney. So you as the qualified medical evaluator have to assure yourself of a mind frame of neutrality in completing your opinions and conclusions in your report. And the best way to do this is to provide opinions and conclusions in your report that qualify as substantial medical evidence. When you can qualify your opinions and conclusions as substantial medical evidence, it'll be highly likely, 99.9% likely, that your opinions and conclusions are free of any type of bias or discrimination, and that your opinions and conclusions will be accurate and will be largely reflective of what's true based upon the facts of the particular case. So this is interesting. This is not the only new declaration that's going to be required when the new QME regulations pass. So we're seeing instances where we're being required to, under more scenarios, provide declarations under penalty of perjury that we're doing the right thing at all times. And this ensures that we do the right thing after the face-to-face evaluation. This ensures that we do the right thing absent any form of bias or absent any form of discrimination in the production of our written opinions and conclusions. Okay? Well, what about even after that? What about after we submit our report and as we go along our long, lengthy career as qualified medical evaluators? What about after that? Well, even after that, the Division of Workers' Compensation is not going to be done with you, or it's not going to be done with I. They have an ongoing plan to stamp out bias. So part of the new language of CCR 55B relating to the continuing education requirements for us as qualified medical evaluators includes that we continue with 2 hours of instruction in anti-bias training every 2 years. Every 2 years, in order to reappoint for a new 2-year period, we have to document and show to the Division of Workers' Compensation that we've completed at least a 2-hour module in anti-bias training that meets the qualifications that we described earlier for new QME applicants, and that is training in unconscious or implicit bias and stereotyping, and how those unconscious biases and stereotypes affect our medical decision making. Number 2, we have to document that we've received training in possible gender discrimination, and how gender discrimination can adversely and inaccurately impact permanent impairment and apportionment ratings. That's number 2. And number 3, every 2 years we'll be required to review examples as to how permanent impairment ratings for injured workers with industrial breast cancer, how those permanent impairment ratings need to be constructed and construed in order to more accurately describe the female gender's impairment rating after industrial breast cancer and after treatment related to industrial breast cancer. So these are things that the Division of Workers' Compensation is asking us to revisit every 2 years in order to keep the potential for bias at top of mind, and to keep top of mind the concept of us to eliminate or reduce the impact of bias in our opinions and conclusions. So they're targeting this directly by requiring that we revisit the subject every 2 years. And then, for those qualified medical evaluators who just don't seem to get the concept, or don't understand the concept that implicit bias and unconscious bias and stereotyping impacts the opinions and conclusions to the detriment of the injured worker, the Division of Workers' Compensation has measures to eliminate those qualified medical evaluators from the system by denying their reappointment for a new 2-year term. So this is described under CCR 5110. A QME can be denied reappointment for failing to render expert opinions or conclusions without regard to an injured worker's race, sex, national origin, religion, or sexual preference. Now, as we're going to talk about in our next session, we all have stereotypes and biases, implicit biases, based on each one of these targets. We've had these for many, many years. Many of them are implicit, they're unconscious. And so eliminating all of them may or may not be possible. But it's when those implicit biases adversely impact the examinee's or injured worker's right to benefits to which they are deserve it, to benefits to which they qualify, that cannot be tolerated by the Division of Workers' Compensation, because the workers' compensation system is designed to accurately benefit those persons injured in the course of employment. And qualified medical evaluators who fail to opine accurately without regard to these implicit biases need to be replaced, and the division has a plan for replacing those doctors who simply cannot adopt this concept into their mental mindset of performing these evaluations. Additionally, for qualified medical evaluators who are found to be participating in 3 or more instances of activity during the most recent period of appointment that constitute a failure to communicate with the injured worker in a respectful, courteous, and professional manner, for those qualified medical evaluators who violate the disclosure requirements, that is, this is referring to the disclosure requirements. If you're rude, abusive, hostile, or discriminatory in any way, and you're found to be, this is found out on 3 or more occasions, well, you're going to be replaced as a qualified medical evaluator, because these types of communication strategies are counter to the Division of Workers' Compensation's intent that injured workers be treated with respect, that they be treated with courtesy, and that they be treated professionally, and that we as qualified medical evaluators render our opinions along the spirit of these same considerations for each and every injured worker. So doctors, I hope this helps you. This is an introduction to anti-bias training in the qualified medical evaluation even before these proposed changes to the QME regulations become enacted into law. So this is going to help you start to be thinking along the proper lines of direction that the Division of Workers' Compensation wants to see us taking in our future evaluations, and that is treating injured workers better, treating injured workers with more respect, and providing injured workers with an accurate physical examination, and providing opinions and conclusions in our reports that are accurate and that are not based upon pre-reflective attitudes, pre-reflective preconceptions and stereotypes that we may have had since our own childhood, that we carry with us into every interaction throughout our day-to-day life, including our interactions with injured workers. And unfortunately, these preconceived and pre-reflective attitudes can adversely impact the benefits to which these different outgroups of people may be entitled, and the Division of Workers' Compensation has an obligation to the public to provide accuracy in all reporting. So doctors, I hope this helps you. In our next session, we're going to talk about some of the many examples and instances and specific cases where bias and discrimination was discovered in the QME evaluation process, and how that discrimination and bias adversely impacted the injured workers. So this is going to be a fascinating and eye-opening discussion for you. So for today, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm looking forward to being with you on our very next session as we continue our ongoing series entitled The Update on the QME Regulations. For now, I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.